if my mom were alive today, the first thing she would tell me after listening to this episode is, Tim, you told me nothing good would ever come from you watching Hee Haw. Anyway, this is Tim the Nerd, and we got Professor Aubrey here for a very, very special episode of Friends Talking Nerdy here. Professor Aubrey, we have a guest. Why don't you introduce our guest to our friends?
We do have a guest, a very exciting guest today. Her name is Ellen Pethel, and she's an associate professor at Belmont University, where she teaches and directs the Global Honors Program, as well as hosting students from Ireland at Belmont for a special program. And you could describe yourself as a public historian. So your education is in history, and you participate a lot in things in Nashville that are helping Nashville to be a city that is aware of its heritage and history. And one of those things is called Nashville Sites. And that program, and you're the director of that program. And my understanding is that it provides historic-based walking and driving tours and other information about Nashville for visitors. Is that right?
Yeah. And let me just say thank you so much for having me. I do love to talk nerdy, so this is perfect. Yeah, Nashville Sites is a great platform that was inspired by a post-grad class that I took through George Mason University. And it has developed over the last 6 years, and especially over the last 3 years, has really grown in terms of its influence and also just its visibility. And so it's they're walking and driving tours, but it's completely self-guided. And for those of you who are Nashville curious, as I like to call it, you can take any of these tours anywhere in the world that has an internet connection. Right. So one of the features of this is that we offer in-person tours, and you don't need a guide, right? You go to nashvillesites.org, you select a tour. We've got current photos, historic photos. We've got the text you can read. We've got the audio narration you can listen. It's credibly curated. Every tour is written by a local expert or an academic in the field, and so it's history that you can trust. Right, in this information age of AI slop and disinformation, Nashville Sites exist to sort of cut through that noise. But also, you can sit on your couch in Portland, Oregon, and pull up a tour, hit play on the narration, and journey through time and through some of Nashville's history and culture. And so, we're super excited. You mentioned the fact that I teach at Belmont. I always tell people that my dissertation was about Nashville, because Nashville is a different kind of southern city that actually in the 1890s leaned into its reputation as a hub for higher education, when a lot of southern cities, most southern cities, saw that as a threat of some way, the Yankee invasion kind of thing. And so, but Nashville leaned into that and was known as the Athens of the South, which is why we actually, and strangely, have a full-scale replica of the Greek Parthenon in Nashville. And so my dissertation was about that. It was about Nashville as a center of higher education in the South, and how that created our city's image long before any music came along, country or otherwise came along. And so I wrote that, and then it ended up getting published into a book, Athens of the South. It came out, and I thought, well, sure, this is going to get me the tenure track job that I want. It did not. It sold well for an academic book, but I think it sold maybe 3,000 copies total. Nashville Sites is now up to 3,000 users a week. And so I just say that to say that I am a historian, but the public historian, making history accessible to people, at a wider audience, to anybody anywhere, that's really where you can cut through the noise. That's how you can make a difference and help to educate people and engage people at the same time.
It's so great. It sounds like a wonderful thing if you were planning a trip to Nashville, some way to get some background to sort of say, oh, well, that's something I would want to see, like the Parthenon. And so I want to tell you that I am actually from Tennessee as well. I'm from Maryville, Tennessee, which is very close to Knoxville, Tennessee, in the eastern part of the state, which is in the mountains, which is very different ecosystem wise from where Nashville is. And it's culturally different from Nashville.
It
But I
is.
have spent a lot of time in Nashville. My cousin currently lives in Nashville, and she's a graduate of Belmont University. And
Well,
so,
there you go.
yeah, so I thought, oh, well, we have that connection in common. And what I find when I talk to people from the South is there's always this moment of trying to figure out how are we connected to each other. I think people in the South sometimes feel like we're related. It's a big family, and so that's sort of the first thing I do with people from the South is say, how could we possibly be connected? And so when I saw that about Belmont University, I thought, well, that's how. And I wanted to mention that you also wrote a book about Pat Summitt and Title IX and her influence on women's basketball, but also just women's sports in general and women's history.
Yes, I encourage you to check that out. That book came out about 3 years ago, and I wrote it for the 50th anniversary of Title IX, which was in 2022. And so, everybody's got a COVID story, and so mine was this book. And I always say one of the cool things is that I had already gotten the contract to do the book, and I wanted, instead of it being this monologue that I created with just quotes from other people, I wanted the oral histories to drive it. And so in a way, this book is also a public history project, because the main source of all the chapters, with a few exceptions, of course, especially those who had previously passed away, like Pat, it is an oral history collection that then I took and wrote really thematic essays about each person. The chapters are short. They tell great stories. We put Pat Summitt's name in the title because she has the most name recognition, but there are indeed 50 women that are represented. And so COVID hits, I already had the green light for the book, and then you're like, well, how am I going to interview a bunch of mostly older women over 65 in the middle of a pandemic? I'm not. But the beauty of it is that, COVID didn't really have an upside. But if there was a silver lining that for this book project, it forced everybody, it accelerated the collective learning curve of people who never would have learned how to Zoom or Google Meet or FaceTime because they had to stay connected. And so suddenly all the people that I wanted to interview, I could still interview. And it actually allowed me to expand the number of people that I planned to interview, because suddenly time and distance didn't matter so much. So I ended up being able to interview Monica Abbott, who is an Olympian and professional softball player, recently retired. She was in Japan. I was able to interview the 1984 Olympic swimmer who was the best her era, Tracy Calkins. She was in Australia, right? So I was able to end up really expanding and interviewing women all across the country. And so that's a great book. And I will also put in a plug for, there is a new documentary out about Pat Summitt that came out March 22nd, something like that, but recently. And I can't remember which streaming service it's on, but I think that now that Pat's been gone 10 years, which is crazy. She passed away 10 years ago, but her legacy seems to only her legacy continues to be elevated. And they just had in Knoxville, as you know, and you're from Maryville, 45 minutes away, they just had a huge event honoring her in the past week or so, where they brought everybody in from all over the country. Dawn Staley, Candace Parker, and they had this multi-day set of panels and guest speakers. And so I think she just continues to inspire a lot of people.
Absolutely. And probably Tim the Nerd doesn't know who this is. I'm not sure, but Pat Summitt was the longtime head coach of the Lady Vols. I think they're still called the Lady Vols.
Yeah, they're one of the few that embraced it, and in fact, they tried to take the lady off because a lot of teams, it was like, oh, that was like the lady whatever, and so they wanted
like
to
diminutive in some way,
right. Lady Vols built such a brand that it actually was to their advantage to keep their logo. So they took away the lady part for a while, and then the Lady Vols program, their brand was actually just as popular as the regular UT brand, and so they allowed them to bring it back. Yeah, but she was there from she started coaching as a head coach at the age of like 23 in 1977 or so, and then retired after being diagnosed with early onset dementia, and then passed away in 2016. But when she passed away, she was the winningest coach in men's or women's basketball.
And for the record, I did watch enough ESPN in the 80s and 90s to know who she is. So there we go.
She's the one.
That's great.
For those of you who don't know, she was known for the stare. They always said she could see straight through your soul when she gave you that stare. So anyway, that was a wonderful project, and that's a gift that keeps on giving, because the other 49 women are far lesser known, and they're the ones that were the unsung heroes that helped to create women's sports at their institutions, competitive at the college level, and they're also the ones who laid the groundwork for Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese did not fall out of the sky. Those are two of the biggest stars that were in college now in the WNBA. They are having the success in women's sports. The phrase you hear now is everyone watches women's sports. That is the really the result of what the people did a generation before them. And that was the Pat Summitt generation, right? That led up through the 96 Olympics, where women's basketball, women's soccer, women's softball, track and field, and gymnastics all win gold, right? That was the first generation of girls who had grown up under the protections of Title IX. That was Pat Summitt's work, and so many others like her.
Yeah, really inspiring, really inspiring. And then finally, before we start talking about this book, I wanted to ask you, what about Belmont would you like people to know? Because I think it's not a well-known university, but that it does have some really exceptional programs.
Well, Belmont University is a mid-major, as they would call it. It's a private school. Up until 20 years ago, had about 1,800 students. It was very small liberal arts. But in the last 20 years, it has really expanded and grown. We like to call ourselves Nashville's University. We have Vanderbilt that's just across the street, literally. But we have a lot of homegrown and people who are coming from Tennessee and the region who go to Belmont. What it's best known for is its music business programs, and also all the things that come along with music business, audio engineering. We also have a film school, and also in the last 15 years, we've developed a pharmacy college for graduates, a medical college, a law school. And so it's just expanding and growing so quickly. So I said, 20 years ago, we'll say 25 years ago, around 2000, there were about 1,800 students, and there are 9,000 now today.
Whoa.
So it's really grown, and I think a lot of people are attracted. A lot of students are attracted to it because of the programs that we offer. We also have really strong ties with Music Row, so you can come here and be a student, but actually go, Columbia Studio A, where some of the most famous things ever were recorded, and you can use it as a teaching studio, right, as a student and train. So those kinds of opportunities are really incredible. But I would say a lot of the professional programs too. Nursing is huge, but I teach in the honors program and absolutely love it because it allows us flexibility to do really creative things, from working with other universities like Fisk University, a prominent HBCU, to work on a documentary project, or whether it's working with schools in Ireland. You mentioned that earlier. Queen's University Belfast, we do a summer exchange program with them that's really cool that I teach. But honors just allows you the flexibility to do a lot of interdisciplinary cool things and to partner with other people, because it's not quite so static in terms of that general education, you got to take American History 101 kind of thing. right?
Which has to cover certain things.
Right, exactly. So, my class is one of my classes is called The Human Story, and that's the one where we've been studying civil rights, but also making this documentary project. And I have another one called Beyond Borders, where I've partnered with a business professor who's an economist, and we've done this series of debates. And so, it just allows me a lot of flexibility to be intellectually curious. And I'll just end by that part by saying sometimes I can't believe that I am able to have a job where I get paid to be intellectually curious. And that is such a privilege. And I recognize that. And so I hope that through the work that I do, whether it's Nashville Sites or whether it's publishing books, that is my contribution back to, back to this area, but also just back to the public in general. I want to give back as much as I've been given.
Now, the book that brings us all here today is Howdy, the Minnie Pearl story. And it's the first comprehensive biography of Sarah Ophelia Colley Cannon, who is better known as Minnie Pearl. And I want to ask why, given how beloved and iconic Minnie Pearl was, did it take this long for a definitive biography to exist?
That's a great question. So the co-author of this, Don Cusick, who is also a professor at Belmont, but he's been in Nashville for more than 40 years. And he was in the music industry before he became a professor. And so he's really the like connoisseur of and really the resident expert on music history here in Nashville. And so he consulted on a recent documentary project that Ken Burns did. And this came out of PBS. It was a pretty big hit, and it was about the history of country music. I think it was in like 6 or 7 parts. So he consulted on that. And Minnie Pearl was part of a couple of different episodes. And the documentary series actually uses Johnny Cash and June Carter and the Carter family as really their touch point throughout every episode. And if you think about it, if you go way back to the Carter family, they are that first star-powered family that comes out of Appalachia, right, that starts recording and touring. And then you follow that all the way through to June and Johnny being part of the outlaw movement in the 70s. So you can see that. But Don and I both have contended that you could have said the same thing about Minnie Pearl. She could have also been the through line. And the reason she wasn't is because she wasn't a country music star, obviously, right? But when he was doing that documentary, somebody said, one of the producers said, somebody really should do something just on Minnie Pearl. And so really Minnie Pearl, I think, had been neglected as a biography simply because she was a country music star who wasn't a musician. And so I think that she was always mentioned. I think she was always included. But if you're doing something on country music, you're usually focused more on the music. Now, she has been recognized as being groundbreaking in comedy, especially female comedians. And there have been some articles and things like that, but no one had ever just covered her life. And so I think there were 2 reasons why this book project came about. And one is that need for a biography. She did an autobiography in 1979, but she wrote it with a co-author or a ghostwriter, and it was great. She told lots of fun stories, but it was not any kind of in-depth analysis of her. She also stopped in the 1960s, so it didn't include anything that was hee-haw related. It just really stopped with the Aubrey in the 60s. And so that needed an update. That existed, but that's been out of print for 35, 40 years. So that's one reason. So we had that source material. But probably the bigger reason is that a woman named Barbara J. Hall, who is the CEO of TH Entertainment, she's a documentarian, she's a filmmaker. She saw the need for something on Minnie Pearl, also coming out of Ken Burns' documentary. And so she set about making a documentary, and I consulted on the documentary, but not because I know anything about country music. I really don't. And don't tell anybody, but I'm not even a big country music fan. Don did. That's why I needed to bring Don in. Right? But I did, through my research, know a lot about higher education, and I knew a lot about American history, especially for women, in from the 1890s through the early 1950s, or really through the early 1970s. My research had focused a lot on education. If you think about Title IX, even that book was really about higher education. So with Minnie Pearl, who was really Sarah Cannon, she came to school here at Ward Belmont, which was a junior college and a women's junior college that existed from 1913 to 1951 on the campus of Belmont University. So I had that connection to her, and I knew about her college years. I was an expert, so to speak, on higher education during that period. So they asked me to consult on the documentary, and this is pretty typical. So the agreement was, okay, so we can't pay you any money, and the but was that they would give me all of their research, all of the that they did for the documentary, including 30 tapes with a side A, side B, 30 seconds, 30 minutes each side of Sarah interviewing, basically interviewing herself and just note taking, leaving herself memos of stories that she later used part of and her ghostwriter to write that autobiography in 1979. But that gave me like 35 hours of material, and then in addition, they had done a tremendous job with the research for the documentary. So check out the documentary. It's called "Facing the Laughter." Minnie Pearl's on PBS. But when that was all over, they basically handed me all the research to do a book. So you got to do it at that point, right? I mean, that was also the impetus for the book. So it was really all of those things coming together, converging at just the right time, all the pieces falling into place. Don agreeing to be a co-author to really fill in the gaps on the country music industry and the Grand Ole Opry. And so by the time we finally got started, we were able to crank it out in about 11 months.
Wow.
It was a very good documentary. We both did watch that before to do our research for our interview here today. And I'm glad you brought up the tapes too, because that leads to my next question. In the documentary, they did play some of those tapes, and at one point she talked about how Minnie Pearl is a caricature.
Mhm.
And I thought that was very interesting because, unfortunately, to some people that may be familiar with her, she could be associated with mocking country life, but Minnie Pearl herself, Sarah herself, worried that her act would offend her own mother. How did she square that tension between that character and her personal identity?
Mm-hmm. It's an incredible thing. I learned anytime you work on a project, you learn a lot, right? And so I learned so much about Sarah Cannon and Minnie Pearl, but also about Southern culture and comedy and music and what it was for who and what it wasn't for other people. And something that I came away with that I didn't know going into the project, but something that just sort of organically rose to the top is that this woman somehow managed to be two entirely different people and was authentic in both. Like people loved Sarah Cannon. They loved Minnie Pearl. They didn't see her as mocking country music. They saw her as laughing with them, not at them. That was a concern when she first started. But the people at the Grand Ole Opry loved Minnie Pearl and didn't really think about the Sarah Cannon. And those who just knew Sarah Cannon thought of her as Sarah Cannon and the Minnie Pearl being a caricature. So she was somehow authentically able to be two people. And it was really it's like the phone booth for Superman. For Minnie Pearl, it was the hat. So if she was in just everyday clothes, she's Sarah Cannon. If she put the hat on, she became Minnie Pearl. Even if she had on regular clothes, because sometimes she would put the hat on but not have on the full costume. And so that was sort of her cue that she was going into character. But the other thing that comes through in the book, and she's wasn't a perfect woman. Nobody was, nobody is, but she was universally beloved by pretty much everyone who had any kind of contact or relationship with her. And I don't just mean, if you saw the documentary, you saw some of the usual suspects, Garth Brooks, Brenda Lee, Reba McEntire, but also somebody like Paul Rubens, who was best known as Pee Wee Herman, and also Shelley Wright, who was a country star who later came out as queer, but she had met Minnie and worked with Minnie while she was still in country music. And then even people like Cecily Tyson or Whoopi Goldberg. I mean, she had such a range of friends, and she was really known as, or not known as, she was a matriarch of a lot of things, of female comedians. I think that's why she and Whoopi were close, and why she and Paul, and then she and Paul Rubens, because they were both had comedy characters that were alter egos. She had this special way to bond with each individual person that she came in contact with. Couldn't find anybody who didn't like Minnie Pearl or Sarah Cannon, depending on how
Wow.
you're doing that. And so I'll also just say this too, that the last chapter of the Minnie Pearl book, I got permission from the documentary team to do this. I was thinking, how am I going to incorporate all of these hours of interviews with all these really famous people? And because the chapters read very thematically, like you can read a chapter about one part of her life and then put it down and then pick it up. But I was struggling with how to incorporate all of those present day interviews with the rest of the book. And so the last chapter is just called Star-Studded Memories. And I went through all of the interviews and I pulled excerpts from the interviews of the stars and the celebrities in their own words. And that's what's in that last chapter. And I think that was the perfect way to do it, because I'm not trying to connect them or interpret them. I'm just letting them speak for themselves. And some of the stories that they tell are just so heartwarming, and so personal, that it gives you more insight into who she was as a person, as well as who she was as a performer.
Well, as an East Tennessean, of course, Dolly Parton is she's huge, right? In every way, she's huge. And she was one of the people that Minnie really took under her wing at the Opry. And, just thinking about what kind of mentor she was and what she might, what was her advice to Dolly, or what was she trying to encourage in Dolly as Dolly was progressing from being an 18-year-old kid to really being a superstar?
Well, Dolly, she wasn't in the documentary. It wasn't able to work out time-wise. But we were able to get her to write a quote that is on the back cover of the book. And also we used it as what's called a frontispiece. It's not long enough for a forward, but it's opposite the title page. And it's got a great picture of Dolly and Minnie on stage at the CMA Awards, I think it was. And then we put the quote there as well. So Minnie Pearl and Dolly Parton were really the quintessential mentor and mentee. Dolly wasn't able to be in the documentary because she had some time conflicts with the scheduling, but we reached out to her to ask her if she would provide a story or a quote or write something for us. And Don Cusick actually knows Dolly Parton. And so he reached out to her team directly. And I had asked Don, I said, well, do you think that we should draft something and send it over as just a starting point for her to, think about what direction we're going? And he said, oh no, Dolly likes to do all of her own writing. And I said, great. And so he sent it off and we sat back and waited. And then one night I checked my email and Don had forwarded to me and he said, here's what we got from Dolly. Now, he had wisely taken off her email address, or otherwise I would have had access to Dolly Parton's personal email. But no, I'm kidding. I would. But so she sent this quote, and so it ended up making the back cover, and then it's also the frontispiece, which is opposite the cover page, and it's got a great picture of Dolly and Minnie that are presenting an award at some award show together, and it's got this quote also below that. So Dolly says, Minnie Pearl became my friend in 1968. I was 18 years old, new in town, and Minnie Pearl took me under her wing. She gave me good advice, the how-tos, the how-not-tos, the when-tos, and the when-not-tos. I learned a lot from her as a woman and as a professional entertainer, but above all that, as a good, solid human being. Minnie was more than a big laugh. She was a big heart, and I will always love her. I think that captures how most people felt about Minnie Pearl / Sarah Cannon.
One of the things I noticed about Sarah Cannon, who I didn't really know before reading the book, I didn't really get that how much of an alter ego Minnie Pearl was for Sarah Cannon. But one thing that I noticed was, man, when she was, in her Sarah Cannon personality, boy, she was stylish.
Oh, yeah.
And, the opposite sort of Minnie Pearl, who was not very stylish.
Right.
She just looks amazing in everywhere she appears as Sarah Cannon is one thing I noticed. I don't know if that occurred to you.
Yes.
But.
Well, and her autobiography that I mentioned that came out in 1979, if you get a chance, I mean, I'm not saying you need to order the book. There are still a few out there that you can grab, but you can see the cover and maybe the back cover. I think this also helps to explain her a little bit, is that the front cover is in color. And it's Minnie Pearl's, just her face, like leaning to the side with the hat and the price tag hanging down. And she's got this big expression on her face. Mouth kind of open, smiling, just boom, right in your face. The back cover is in black and white, and it has her sitting, just from the shoulders up, or, like a headshot. And she's in a suit with a silk blouse, and her hair is in a French twist, and she's got on her pearls. And at the bottom of that, at the bottom on the back cover, it says Mrs. Henry Cannon. And so, I mean, there was this dichotomy, that she was able to navigate. And I think she loved being both people. Now, she struggled with Minnie Pearl for a long time. She wanted to be a serious actress. She wanted to be on Broadway. She wanted to be a movie star. But she graduated from Ward Belmont with a degree in theater in 1932. So the middle of the Depression. People were having a lot of time finding work, period, much less a young woman who's looking for a job in the arts. And so her lifeline was this traveling theater production company called the Sewell Production Company that went around to small towns all over the South, and it was really a fundraising mechanism. And so the Sewell Company would provide a director, and they would provide the costumes and the scripts. And then the towns had to provide lodging for the director, and they had to provide the actor. So it was an amateur play. And at the end of 10 days, the town put on the play, usually sponsored by a PTA or a Lions Club, or some civic organization. And they also had, the director collected advertisements from local businesses all during the week, during the day, before the practices at night. And so those all appeared in the program, along with all the people who were in the cast that were local. And everybody loved seeing their name, and the advertisements worked. And so once they had the final night and had the play, then the Sewell Company got 60% of the profit, and the town got the other 40%. And so it was a way for organizations to fundraise. And then the director was paid out of that 60% cut. And so that's the job that Sarah got when she was 21 years old, and set out on the road, going to all of these small towns. And if you just think about the logistics of that, or the reality of being a young woman traveling by yourself with this massive trunk of sweaty costumes and, wrinkled scripts, and then having to deal with a lot of people who, as she said, when she got to a lot of these towns, They really didn't want her to be there. A lot of them had gone for the bait when they were called or contacted by the Sewell Company. By the time the time arrived for the week leading up and the play, most of them had lost any momentum or just didn't want to do it anymore. And so she had to win them over. And it was those 6 years that she was on the road that allowed her to create what became the Grinder Switch community, which was the imagined community that Minnie Pearl used. And then she was actually inspired by a woman named Maddie Burton in northern Alabama. That's who she actually modeled the character after. And Maddie and Jim Burton, who took her in, had a son and who was called Brother, and that was one of the more famous characters in her skit. But also, interestingly, Grinder Switch, it was this imagined community. It was sort of like Lake Wobegon, right? You don't ever see them or meet them, but they all have these personalities. And a key to her comedy is that she was self-deprecating, as a lot of comedians are, but she used those imaginary characters so that her humor and her comedy was never mean-spirited. It was never pointing at someone and getting a laugh at their expense. And that was another key component of her comedic style.
Interesting here. Now, earlier you did mention that she was kind of a matriarch for, basically the country music industry during her time. And, being involved with the Aubrey, she shared the stage with Hank Williams, Patsy Cline, and Johnny Cash. I know she helped warm up the crowd at the Aubrey on Johnny Cash's debut.
So just to because I haven't mentioned her debut on the Opry, is that she debuts in 1940, right on the cusp of the U.S. entrance into World War II, but World War II is already going on. And so she debuts, and she's, let's see, how old is she at the time? She's like 27, 28. Very young woman. And that's actually the picture that's on the front cover of the book, is her as a young woman, and she's speaking into the WSM microphone, which is, WSM is the radio station of the Grand Ole Opry. So then she goes on this, what's called the Camel Caravan with Pee Wee King, who is a famous country star, and they go to all these bases domestically in the U.S. to do these shows, much like the USO, akin to that, to do these shows for these soldiers. And so that's really where she develops her routine. She really gains her chops on that. Like, you're talking to a bunch of young men who don't want to necessarily go to war. They don't want to be away from home, and now you've got to try to make them laugh. So she really got tough because those soldiers were a tough crowd quite often. But by the time that finishes, she already had then another group of people. These soldiers had listened to her throughout World War II, not only with those shows, but then she was on the Grand Ole Opry, and that was broadcast to soldiers all over the world in World War II. So that also helped her name recognition. But by the time she then goes on the road with Pee Wee King, now she's been doing it about 7-8 years, and she's in her 30s, and a lot of these young men were still in their 20s. So she was older than them, but I wouldn't say she's not the matriarch that you think of when you think of the silver-haired woman of Hee Haw, right? But I think because she was stable, she was sober. I mean, not that she didn't drink some, but she didn't have an addiction to anything. She became known on the road as Mother Confessor. That was one of the things she was called. And I think that a lot of these young men were troubled. Hank Williams in particular, she had a very strong relationship with. But all of them. I mean, that an entertainer's life, a musician's life, often comes with a lot of issues with substance abuse or with infidelity and all kinds of things, right? It's a hard life being an entertainer. And so she found herself with people just opening up to her, and then she would give them advice. So, and it wasn't just the young men. then I think, especially as June Carter and Patsy Cline, and then you get that next generation of the Dolly, the Reba, the Tanya Tucker, then you also have the women who are coming to her, and they're coming to her for a different reason, really. They're coming to her and saying, like, how do we make it in this male-dominated world? And frankly, the country music world also being one that has, shall we say, some limited versions of not just equality, but just feminism too, right? And so she really helps them to navigate that. And I always say too with Minnie Pearl, like much like Pat Summitt, they would have never called themselves a feminist because that in the South has this taboo. Still trying to figure out why. I mean, I know why, but like the word itself. But you could be a feminist if you just both Pat Summitt and Minnie Pearl, they were feminists, right? They wouldn't have claimed that label because it would have been detrimental to them. But what I've found through my career is that increasingly I am realizing that I write about women and leadership in non-traditional ways, like women who influence culture and policy and sports and law, who just don't necessarily have this label. They're not activists, but they are working within their own industries to really be incredible leaders. And so I think that's what Minnie does throughout her career. She has a really touching story that's in the book about Hank Williams, and that she met him before he was even a star, and then she saw his star rise. And then she was doing a show somewhere, I think it was Dothan, Alabama, and she was warming up the crowd, and Hank wasn't there yet. And then Pee Wee King got there ahead of Hank, and so he went out and relieved Minnie. And so they were still waiting on Hank to get there. And so she goes off stage, and she says a few minutes later that this man walked in and she didn't even recognize him because he was emaciated at this point. He was high at that moment. And so, but people had paid to come see him. So the show organizer literally like dunked his head in water. They gave him coffee, and he went out and did some kind of show. I don't know how the performance actually was. There's no comment about that. But then they were supposed to do another show the next day or later that night. And so the show organizer tasked Minnie and Hank's wife, Aubrey, with driving him around in the car so he wouldn't go out and get high again. And at that point, so he started so while she said it was the longest night of her life, that while they were driving around, that he started, he needed another, whether it was a drink or whether it needed more pills, he started going through some withdrawals and or some cravings, and that he was physically in pain. So Minnie said, well, let's sing, Hank. She said that they always used to sing, I Saw the Light. And so she started singing, and she said he joined in, and then all of a sudden his voice just broke. And he said, that's just it, Minnie. There ain't no light. Mm. And that man was dead 3 months later. And so she talks about stories like that. She talks about the effect of Patsy Cline's death on her. She saw a lot of things. She had to deal with a lot of really tough circumstances. And she herself went through breast cancer and became a champion for cancer in both her role as Minnie and as Sarah. And had a double mastectomy and came out publicly when people weren't talking about breast cancer very much. But she was always a positive, optimistic person, despite having to deal with a lot of tough circumstances. And I think that's why she was so well respected in the industry, not just in country music, but just in the entertainment industry writ large.
You mentioned Hee Haw. It ran from 69 to 91, and Hee Haw for me is my first example growing up of the concept that not all entertainment is made for you, right? Wasn't a fan at the time, but I've actually come back to rewatch it. I know in 2020, I guess there were some episodes of Hee Haw that were on the Roku channel, and Professor Aubrey and I were able to watch an episode, and we saw Bill Monroe and Ricky Skaggs do a song together, which was really cool to see. But Hee Haw brought Minnie Pearl to the show. Hee Haw was like a counter balance to Laugh-In at the time, and was also the victim of the rural purge at CBS. It was originally a CBS show, and any show that had a tree or anything like that was kicked off the network in favor of shows like All in a Family and whatnot. But bringing Minnie Pearl was interesting too, because that would be comparable at the time to like Gracie Allen being cast on Laugh-In, And so how did her character change for the TV format, if it did at all?
It really didn't change for Hee Haw. What Hee Haw did was gave Minnie Pearl's character a second act. A lot of the people who came out of the 40s and 50s in the Grand Ole Opry, they were losing popularity. They just, the acts were stale. Entertainment had moved on. And Minnie Pearl and also Lewis Jones, better known as Grandpa Jones, were two of the ones that were able to successfully transition from radio and live shows to television and later syndication. And that's part of why Minnie Pearl, not part of why, it's a big reason why Minnie Pearl endures. Because all three of us know Minnie Pearl from Hee Haw. And so actually in that chapter on Hee Haw, and also there's the establishment of the Nashville network called TNN that no longer exists, but it also started during the 70s, and it was really like the predecessor of CMT. But it allowed country performers and entertainers not to have to go to New York or LA to film things. And so you've got that piece of it. But she's able to make that transition. And Hee Haw, I argue in the book, was really made for Minnie Pearl, right? And she was one of the first people that the producers went after, because they wanted somebody with name recognition. They wanted to do a variety show. You mentioned Laugh-In. They wanted sort of the rural version of Laugh-In, something that was satirical, right, and sort of in your face. But her being on, and so she did sign on, and she, I think she was on the first two episodes, and then they made her a main cast member. And there were only about 6 main cast members. Everybody else sort of came and went. But that's how she enters people's living rooms. That's how she really expands her audience. And I say at the end of that Hee Haw chapter that it gave Minnie Pearl a new audience and a new generation of people, including those watching Hee Haw with their grandparents. And that's a nod to my story and watching Hee Haw with my grandparents, mostly because my parents wouldn't allow me to watch it. Otherwise, they did not like the Hee Haw honeys. And as you rewatch Hee Haw, you recognize that there's a lot of sexual innuendo, and there's some pretty questionable material for somebody who's 6 or 7. But I could still watch it at my grandparents' house, and so I think that she was a big part of that show. And even though you mentioned it got canceled, something that's really cool about Hee Haw is it was only with CBS, like I think 2 years, maybe 3 years, and then they canceled it. And there were a lot of rural themed shows there for a while, right? You've obviously got the Beverly Hillbillies, but you also have shows like Green Acres, and Mr. Ed and some others that are based in a rural setting. And so they cancel it, but the show's producers take a gamble and they go ahead and continue taping live shows, and they put it out for syndication, which basically means will somebody else buy it and show it? Some other television show buy it and sell it. And that ended up being the model of success for them. That was the money ball, because they ended up making more than 300 episodes. They ended up staying in syndication longer than any television show still in history. So they started filming in 1960. Well, they started in 1968. 1969 is really when it goes live. Their last episode is taped in 1993. So it has this incredible run. And in fact, Minnie Pearl doesn't survive. Well, she physically survives, but she has her stroke in 1991 and then is bedbound for the next 4.5 years and passes away in 1996. And the last thing I'll say about Hee Haw is that that's also where you see this passing of the torch. You talked about her as a mentor and some of the older figures like the Hank Williams and the Patsy Cline, but it was Hee Haw that connected her to Dolly Parton, Reba McEntire, Barbara Mandrell, Tanya Tucker, Loretta Lynn. I mean, you name it. And in fact, a few of those women, their national debuts were on Hee Haw. Barbara Mandrell's first national appearance was on Hee Haw. So I think that also brought them together.
Yeah, it seems like she got the opportunity to meet a lot of people when doing Hee Haw to, younger performers, because they did have that format of every week they had different performers on the show.
But looking at the time here, I think we will wrap things up here. So what question do you wish someone would ask you about this book that nobody does, including us? What question would you want asked about this?
Man, that's a good one. That's a really good one. A question that nobody's really asked me that I think is worth asking is, why isn't Minnie Pearl's story better known? And by that I mean whether it's she's been dead for 30 years, right? She's never had a singular treatment until this documentary 3 years ago and this book that frankly happened because of the documentary and the research that took place. But a Minnie Pearl she was in a lot of ways the Dolly of today. We think about Dolly as this person who transcends a lot of things, right? And appeals to so many people. And I think Minnie Pearl was the same way. And I think we need more of those people in this world. And I'm not saying that I need a movie out of this, but sometimes if Minnie Pearl's story ends with the documentary and this book, then it's going to be limited, right? And so it's my hope that this book and the documentary help to get her name back in the conversation, and that it will turn into something that is more prescient and has a better chance of really reaching the larger audiences, because we know that books are great, but reading rates are not. There is an audiobook, and I read it, and I read quite fast, so you can get through it pretty quickly. But you know what I mean? It's like the popular culture aspect. And so I think if the question was like, what's next, is, nobody ever says what's next. It's just to talk about the book. And so I think the question is, I don't know, but I hope something. The closest person that I can think of that's entering this space that would be in the same kind of ballpark as a Minnie Pearl is the comedian Leanne Morgan. And so if you haven't checked out Leanne Morgan, but she's from Tennessee, she's not an alter ego, but she has very similar humor to Minnie. Her characters are real because most of her characters are her family. But she did some Netflix specials, and now she has her own show. To somehow maybe team up with Leanne, or to find some other outlet where we can continue to tell Minnie's story, because the world needs more Minnies.
Absolutely. And what a great biopic that would be. So many
So if you're
great
not invited,
characters.
send them my way, right?
Well, I gotta say myself, first of all, thank you for appearing on Friends Talking Nerdy. The book definitely and the documentary kind of really filled in a lot of blanks, I guess, as to the importance of Minnie Pearl. And I did, asked a question earlier about how some people could view her as mocking country life, but the people that say that are generally not people that are going to take the time to dig into how she developed that character, because I think your book does a great job of, explaining that, because it's not mocking. She never mocked anybody. She treated people with respect. And, like the documentary alone, seeing the amount of people, including like Dwight Yoakam, thankfully we didn't see him with his really tight jeans, thankfully. But, but
Yeah,
just seeing the amount of people she helped along the way, she is definitely one of those stories that needs to be spoken of more, because we speak, people in entertainment speak a lot about, like, Lucille Ball, for instance. Minnie Pearl is her peer and did a lot of opened a lot of the same doors that Lucille Ball did.
And she was also on the Carol Burnett show, so they were also contemporaries.
So before we wrap up, where can people find your book?
Well, it's all the usual suspects. Of course, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, online. But if you want to directly support the publisher, you can go to the University of Tennessee Press website and purchase it from them, which actually then supports the press itself. So it's I appreciate you guys reaching out. I love this conversation. If you decide you want to talk women's sports another time, we can have another conversation. I'm happy to listen. Friends Talking Nerdy, like, I am your people. So happy to talk nerdy anytime.
We would love to have you back.
Thanks.
Anything you want to say, Professor Aubrey?
Just a huge thank you, Mary Ellen. This was a great conversation, and I've learned so much from your work, and I'm excited to delve into some of the other work that you've done, because you have written, I think, 6 books. So I can't wait to dig further into some of the work that you've done.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great. And right now, a lot of my projects are focusing on civil rights. And I mentioned the documentary, but Nashville does not do a good job of telling a civil rights story, and in the same way that, like, Montgomery does, or Atlanta, or Memphis. And we have a great story to tell. So really my focus now is, like, on this public history part of, like, trying to build more intentional places for people to come and learn about civil rights. So that's kind of my new thing. I don't know if there'll be a book out of it or not, but yeah. So great talking to you. Y'all reach out anytime. You got my email, my contact. But so just reach out directly. You've got my email.
That we will. Thank you very much. And thank you, our friends at home, for checking out Friends Talking Nerdy. Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friends.